Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Maximizing Your Supply Chain for Savings Now and in the Future, presented by Mark Cooper of Black Maple Group and Paul Arena of Medline Industries. Please be aware that there will be a question and answer portion today at the end of the webinar. To avoid frequent interruptions during the webinar, please type your questions in the question box located to the right of your screen. They will be answered in the order received during the question and answer portion. Additionally, an electronic version of this presentation will be emailed to all participants following completion of today's webinar, and a recorded version will be available on the website for members only. Again, NJMGMA would like to thank you for attending, and I'll now turn things over to Mark and Paul.
Thanks very much.
Good afternoon.
Paul, do you want to dive in? Thank you, Paul. Go ahead.
Sure can. Alex, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being a part of this call this afternoon. Just a quick introduction. So I am Paul Arena with Medline. Medline and the NJMGMA recently got acquainted at the most recent exhibit in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And it was a great turnout, and we look forward to doing more exhibits and just a lot more overall with NJMGMA. So quick information on Medline. Some of you might know who Medline is. Some of you might not. Medline is a manufacturer and a distributor for medical supplies, and we are the only manufacturer that supplies directly to the end user in the non-acute market. Also on the call is Mark Cooper. He's with Black Maple Group. Black Maple Group is a consulting firm that we partnered with, and I'll let Mark talk about his company, but really his consulting firm helps overall maximizing the supply chain for our customers. And also on the call, we have Gary Pancoast with Inteleer. Inteleer is a GPO that we partnered with. It's the preferred GPO for this program. And we're going to be diving into GPOs, what they are, how to find out if you're a member of one or not, and really how to maximize that relationship with your GPO, not just on medical supplies, but on everything else that they can offer. And there's a lot. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark so he can go over that.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much for the warm intro, and thanks to everybody who's part of this discussion today. By way of background, I want to take just a moment on myself and on Black Maple Group. I myself am a career change management person. I worked for a decade for a company called Capital One, doing large-scale mergers and acquisitions and integrating businesses, and working directly on changing products and delivery models to customers. And that's really where my passion is. The Black Maple Group was founded by my business partner, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Gold, who is a career health administrator. The company was founded down in South Florida in 2007. And what I would tell you is our primary focus is on bringing business rigor to the provider world, and we have had tremendous success in doing that work with independent physician offices, surgery centers, laboratories, and some hospital systems as well. And in the process of doing that work, we've discovered a few things and a few ways that people can really maximize their dollar within a clinical setting, and it's in that context that I'm thrilled to be able to have this discussion with you today. As Paul mentioned, there are a couple of groups that we do business with, and you see the logos on the bottom of the page. BMG, Paul's with Medline, and he mentioned Gary working with our partners at Inteleer. All right, so with that said, I'm going to take us into the presentation here, and we will start by talking about, forgive me, I've got a computer issue, there we go. Start by talking about how we got into this. So a little over 3 years ago, it's actually closer to 4 years ago, I was with my business partner working on 2 separate accounts that were very similar. And what we found was, in those 2 separate accounts, a variability in their quote-unquote cost of supplies that was upwards of 2x. So that meant that one of them was paying roughly twice as much as the other was, in a different state, but otherwise very much the same kind of patient volumes, the same kind of specialty, the same kind of approach, and we thought something must be off. Here's what we discovered on the balance sheet. First is supplies typically somewhere in your top 5 to 7 items on expenses. Obviously, you start with usually rent, people, and others. You go through utilities, and you end up with supplies somewhere in the 5 to 7 space. And for example, on medical surgical alone, we've discovered that the average provider, not only physician but ordering professional provider, spends $10,000 to $12,000 a year on medical surgical alone. Late 2012, similar groups in different locations, very variable prices for their medical surgical supplies. So what we did is we put on an analysis hat and said, let's dive deeper. And we asked for the full data of what those groups had bought over the space of the last year. We had one group with 150 physicians in multiple specialties. Out of those 150 physicians, we had more than 30 account numbers with one distributor, and they were paying rates that varied by more than 400% for specific items. So think about this for a moment. The same parent company, same distributor, paying variable amounts for the same item. And so we said, look, guys, if all that you do is that you all pay the lowest price that one of you is paying right now, you're going to end up saving some significant money. And so we put our hat on and we said, all right, let's work on a better way and let's see if we can maximize how this works. So the first thing we did is we thought, well, who buys the most and who are the biggest and most prominent players in the provider industry? And of course, that's the acute care world. And we looked at how the acute care supply chain, we looked at how the typical supply chain outside of acute care in physician groups works. And I'll take you through that now. So the usual supply chain, very simple, very straightforward, and unfortunately, it can be expensive. So how does that work? Your manufacturer makes your product. On an average basis, a physician office will use somewhere between, I would say, 50 and 100 manufacturers worth of products, although you can consolidate that down. The way the supply chain works is the manufacturer, oh goodness, I'm sorry. See if we can get back to this. The way the supply chain works is the manufacturer makes the product, and of course what they want to do is they want to sell as many as possible, and they have a markup between their cost and what they want to sell it for. That's how they're profitable. Typically what they then do is they sell that to a distributor, and a distributor does a few things. Obviously they buy the product from the manufacturer. In some cases they will private label it and put their logo on a product that's manufactured by somebody else. And in some cases, they will simply warehouse it. They store it, and then it's their job to take orders from customers, to distribute those products, bring them to the customers, and ultimately the provider pays. And in this model, you have a manufacturer markup with their sunk costs. They need to make money. You have a distributor markup with their sunk costs. They need to make money. And you put them all together, and this is where you end up. So then we said, okay, how does it work for large acute care systems? Obviously, in the acute care world, there's a lot more money churning. And so as a result, there's a lot more flexibility with regard to the ability to watch the pricing and ensure that it is contract compliant. And so how does that one unfold? The answer is you have a couple of additional players in this picture. So in the acute care world, for the most part, a manufacturer provides a product to a distributor, but they don't do it directly and without parameters. They do it through a GPO or a group purchasing organization. So typically an acute care provider will have 1 or 2 or more GPO relationships, but there will be a primary group purchasing organization involved. Now, a group purchasing organization's primary job is to negotiate contracts on behalf of its members with manufacturers who supply the things that they need. And so you see the note under here. It says that the GPO holds contracts and it administers them. So their job is to negotiate those contracts and go back and administer them and say, okay, manufacturer X, let's say it's somebody like a Becton Dickinson, our client is buying this many of these, and according to our contract, the pricing for these units should be this. That leads me to the next point, which is the point below. It says tiered and committed based on the size of the client. Okay, so there are two ways that pricing gets better through group purchasing organizations. The first way it gets better is through something called tiering, and that's basically a volume play. So no different than, let's say that there were, out of the people on the call today, let's say that 5 of you get together and say you all want to buy a new Honda Accord. If you go together to the dealership, you're going to get a lower price per unit than if you went individually and separately to 5 different dealerships. That's essentially what aggregation does, and it allows for something that's called tiering. And typically, the higher the tier, the lower the price per unit, because what's happening is the GPO is bringing volume to the manufacturer, and in exchange for bringing that volume, the manufacturer is saying that they will sell those units for slightly less. That's what a tiered contract is. A committed contract is based on a percentage of use of a like product. So we see committed contracts, for example, all the time on things like sutures. You could say, I'm going to buy 80% of my sutures from this manufacturer, and I commit to that, and therefore, as a result, your price is lower. And the vast majority of providers have a combination of those contracts. The last thing I'll hit on here with the GPO, because it's important, is this notion that's in the end of that second bullet point, which is ensuring consistent and predictable markup for the distributor. When something is on contract, and I want you guys to think of that as like in air quotes, when something is on contract with a GPO, that means that it is contractually bound to be within a certain price range and at a certain price depending on the volume. And what that means is the control over the variability in the price is something that is being advocated for on behalf of the provider by the group purchasing organization. Okay? And certain group purchasing organizations also do a lot more close partnering with their provider clients and help them to look for additional ways to get products onto contract and to save more money. So in this model, the distributor buys the product from the manufacturer, but does it within some very clear parameters set by the GPO contracts. It doesn't stop there. There's a second check on the system, which you see in here as the purchasing office. Typically, that's something that, again, in a large acute care system, they can afford to have a purchasing director or a VP of supply chain, and that individual in that office, they do two things. They consolidate products to drive up volume. So again, remember the example of going in with the 5 cars to the Honda dealership. If you are in a provider organization and you buy, I'll take an example from our own clients, 17 different kinds of exam gloves, you don't need 17 different kinds of exam gloves, you need 5 or 6. And if you consolidate those products, what's going to happen is they will buy more of those 5 or 6 because they're taking the volume from the 17. That drives compliance, which drives up the volume and drives down the price. So it's a second check on the system that occurs more locally, and that ends up in the provider's hands. And you see, therefore, there's a check between the manufacturer and the distributor, and another one between the distributor and the provider. Okay. That led us, remember in the situation that we saw with a lot of variability with our client groups on the consulting side, that led us to a key question, which is, how can a smaller group make the most of acute-like savings, so behave like a large acute care system, and learn from the expertise while ensuring that, number one, as much as possible is, again, quote-unquote, on contract, so that there is that check on the system. Number two, that there's maximizing of direct-to-manufacturer savings when that's possible. And number three, for me personally, the holy grail, this notion of savings over time. And so I want to take a moment on this savings over time piece, because we see a great deal in the marketplace of people saying, I would like you to switch to my service and I will save you X dollars. And they do the analysis, and there's a one-time savings at that moment in time of a certain amount. That's a fantastic thing. Anytime you can save money, especially pre-tax money, it's great because it helps drive the bottom line of the owners of the corporation, which for many of us is the physicians themselves. That said, it's just one time. And so the question that we asked is there a way to build that in so that it's ongoing savings and that there's a mechanism without having to rebid or go out there to market or do what I call coupon cutting to look at item to item to item versus distributor versus manufacturer. That to us was the big business case we wanted to solve for. The answer is we've taken quite a bit of time and we have found and discovered a great way to make the most of that and address the vast majority of those questions. And that's what you see here broken out in slide 6. So it's a hybrid model. And what it does is it makes the most of the notion of a GPO, and it creates, in between the GPO and the distributor, it creates an aggregator who serves in a client service mode with the provider and helps do a lot of those things that you saw me take you through when I was talking about the acute care model of supply chain. So here's how this model works. Your manufacturer makes the thing. It goes through the GPO with all of those parameters that I shared with you earlier, okay? On contract as much as possible within guide rails set by others, set by contract, so that the person who's purchasing it knows that it's at a reasonable national rate, okay? Then it goes through a group called an aggregator. So let me talk a little bit about what an aggregator can do in this kind of model. What an aggregator does, literally, is aggregate, put stuff together. When I was playing with putting these slides together, I thought of the idea of a blowfish. You guys have all seen these on, Discovery Channel. The idea of a fish that looks very small until there's a need to appear larger, and then all of a sudden the fish looks a whole lot bigger and then goes back to looking smaller. What an aggregator does is an aggregator puts together the volume of multiple members to make themselves look bigger. Okay, so you see the point in here, combining buyers into a buying group, creating more volume. If you think about it, if we get 5 people together to go buy Honda Accords off of this phone call, and there are 20 people at some other state-based MGMA discussion occurring in, let's say, Oregon, now we got 25 worth of purchase. And we can add those to Texas, to Illinois, and to others. And guess what? Now we're arriving with a really big chip, and now we're able to really get a fantastic unit price for those. That's the basic notion of aggregating for more volume. Critically, for an aggregator to work is they need to be in very close partnership with a GPO and a distributor. The reason they need to be in close partnership with a GPO is a GPO needs to accept their aggregation so that they can then go back to the manufacturer and say, this aggregation group didn't buy 5 Honda Accords, it bought 25, therefore we want the price to be better. That helps keep prices low. A good aggregation group will also negotiate re-tiering of contracts on a regular basis with the GPO. So what that means is that on some sort of regular basis, the GPO will look at all of the contracts that are being accessed by the aggregator, and they will say, hey, look at this. On, for example, Becton Dickinson syringes, this particular aggregator went from $40,000 of spend last year to this year. They're now at $52,000 of spend, and I see here in the contract that we executed that there's a tier difference that is crossed at $50,000. and therefore the unit price needs to go from, let's say, $10 to $9. That's called a tier audit, and your best aggregators will negotiate doing that regularly. Then on the flip side, working with the distributor partner and working with ultimately the provider on the other end, what they can do is help drive product consolidation and focusing where possible on other ways to save, including direct to manufacturer, as you saw on a previous slide. With that said, and as I think about the client groups that our company works with and that other peer consulting firms across the country work with, it always comes down to, well, this is fine and good, but what does it mean? And when I stop my lunch and I think about how can I save as much possible from the top line of the company to contribute to the bottom line, what do I do? And so we've cast this in a series of questions, but I wanted to lay it out for this group. So the first question is, do you have a group purchasing organization contract for your group? Are you a member of a GPO, or are you a member of several? In some cases, groups are members of several. And have you taken that to the next level? Do you know who the GPO rep is? Apologies for my screen. Sorry about this, folks. That's the first question. Obviously, if you are contractually in a relationship with a GPO and you know who the rep is, you've got a starting point and you can go somewhere with that. Then the question becomes, how do you engage that person? How do you engage that group? The first question I would put out there is, how much of what you buy or of what I buy, if I can sort of wear the hat of an administrator for a moment, is connected and quote-unquote on contract? And you want that percentage to be as high as possible for two reasons. The first is it makes sure that you've got a GPO working for you in making sure that your pricing is where it needs to be. And the second is the more stuff you have quote-unquote on contract, the bigger you are, because the higher your spend number is. And so you're maximizing your volume to look as big as possible to the GPO and by extension to the manufacturer, which will help you drive your pricing down. The next level of that is the next question that's on here, which is there an aggregation group that you are part of and that you are working with? Because ultimately, aggregation groups can help put you together with other providers like you to look bigger, to drive volume higher, and therefore to drive pricing down. The next question is really around margins, and that is, are you minimizing to the extent that you can paying margins multiple times without any control on them? And again, if you buy as much as possible connected on and on contract, number one. Number two, if you're making the most of an aggregation group. And number three, if you're doing what you can to buy direct from the manufacturer, then the answer is you're cutting down on paying those multiple margins as much as possible. Next question, how much labor do you use on coupon cutting? So far, the vast majority of our commentary here in this discussion has been focused on the hard spend on the invoices that you get from your distributor, whether that's a company like McKesson or Henry Schein, or we have the gentleman from Medline on the call today, or a more local distributor. Our discussion has been focusing on what's on there. However, don't forget that there's another cost, and it's a real one, which is the time and labor that goes into checking that, verifying it, and in some cases, cross-shopping, or what I call here coupon cutting. That's time and labor that ultimately can be used to greater gain in practices. We see it all the time with, for example, some of the value-based contracting that's out there. Patient satisfaction is really important, and that involves a high touch operationally in the office. And ultimately, if you repurpose people from doing a lot of coupon cutting because you've answered the questions above, and therefore you're secure in knowing that you're getting a good price, you can actually drive patient satisfaction by repurposing that person out into the waiting room and things like that. Next question that's on the list is, what's the markup? paying a distributor in order to get the product to you. And that's typically a percentage and an amount that you can know, and will open up a discussion with a distributor rep. And we always recommend that people know what their markup is. And then last but not least, this notion of saving money over time. How often do your contracts get re-tiered? Does it happen regularly? Is that contractually bound? Is it something you need to ask for? What is the relevance? And we believe that if you put these questions together in your interaction with your distributor rep and with your GPO rep, we have seen some very real instances of driving significant savings through to your shop on a provider-by-provider basis. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask Paul, who's my co-presenter in this, to see if he's got any further comments. And then, Paul, once you're done with your commentary, if you could open it up to questions, I'd be grateful.
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for that, Mark. So, yeah, GPOs, if you know what they are and understand it, that's great. That's half the battle. But it's something that's out there, and you know, a lot of distributors are not talking about it. GPOs bring a lot of value to the end user, and we like to bring value to our end users, which is why we talk about this. At the end of the call, or maybe even after the call, if you wanted to find out if you are connected to a GPO, you might be and you might not know it. Please feel free to reach out to me, and my phone number will be posted at the end of the presentation. And I can do a little bit of research for you, and I can let you know what GPO you're part of, what your markup is. You might be a member of multiple GPOs and might not even know it. And I could even get you in touch with the local GPO rep. So that's something that I'm just going to offer to anybody on the call. If you want to know where you're at today, you can reach out to me. But that being said, I don't have anything else to add to what Mark said, but I definitely think everybody should just find out if you're on a GPO, and if you have any other questions after this call, please feel free to reach out to any of us directly. But that being said, Alex, I think we can open it up for Q&A if there is any.
Okay. There are no questions in the question box. If anyone has any questions, you can type them in the question box now. We'll just wait a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Mark, can you go to the next slide? I think that's the slide with our information.
Yeah, I forgot I'm the one with control. Just a second. I'm sorry, guys.
It's a nice background, though.
There you go. That's my daughter and my niece buried in snow.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So the presentation will be up on the website for members only. And NJMGMA thanks you for attending the webinar today.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks, everybody, for being on the call. And again, please reach out to us if there's any further questions at all. We'd love to work with you. Thank you very much.
Have a good day, everyone.